saying no great corporation would allow people to be
Hello.
injured on their plant because they
My
could
name
get
is
sued.
Lutsky. I'm the moderator of this panel. I'd like to welcome you all to one of the final events of our conference. A little earlier, George had us acknowledge appropriately the contributions of Nestor and Gina putting this conference together. I think also that we ought to acknowledge some of the people behind the scenes who really have done tremendous work in support of the conference. So we have Greg over here who has helped with AV. And I don't know all the folks, but Catherine, were you part of the staff? And I know Mark has been guarding the food outside, and Susan, and I don't, can someone go out and get him? I think it would be appropriate for us to acknowledge him. He's usually behind the counter.
Yeah, I'm sure, yeah.
Or out having a smoke.
Is that true?
And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
As to what they've been doing.
Yeah, no, and you know, we've been supported so well. This has gone so well, and it's been fabulous. So as soon as we get him in here, I don't know that Susan is around, is she?
She was just,
She is.
Hillary. Criminologist. 2004.
Yeah.
Let's see if they obey.
Somebody we waiting for?
Somebody to come in to get applauded.
Okay. There he is.
There he is. You're speaking. No, we really appreciate the work that you and others have done on behalf of the conference. We just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
And I do it only because I love Nestor, and I hope all of you do too.
Okay, this is a panel on the value and meaning of the obedience research. And the way in which we are structuring this is each person on the panel will have about 10 minutes to address that topic and highlight what he believes to be of value and meaning in the experiments, or questions that can be raised about the value and meaning of the research. I'd like to pose two additional questions for the panelists to think about, and also for all of us to think about. And the first is the following: how has our sense of the value and meaning of these experiments been enriched or altered or challenged by what we've heard over the past 2 days here? And I think it's appropriate to think about that, to reflect on the impact of the conference on our sense of the experiment. And one other question I'd like to throw out there for the panelists or for discussion afterwards, and it begins with a quote from the filmmaker Alex Gibney, who was quite taken with the Milgram Experiment. He was responsible for the film Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. And he was quoted in the New York Times in 2007 as saying, quote, "Everything in life goes back to the Milgram Experiment," unquote. Now perhaps he was overstating. And the question I would like to pose around that is the following: can the Milgram Experiment justifiably carry the meanings we are apparently eager to attribute to it? Are we making more of it than we should? So I turn the mic over to our first panelist.
Thank you. Augustine, Brannigan, University of Calgary. I guess I'm leading off so that you can have rebuttals from the other esteemed members of the panel. I feel like a Republican in the midst of the Milgram aristocracy. Just a note to the people who
Fox in the
organize.
hen house might be closer.
You get your turn. I want to thank the organizers. I haven't been at a conference like this for, I can't remember when. I'm a criminologist. I attend the criminology meetings, and it's usually 2,000 or 3,000 people, and we get to meet a handful of people. But at this conference, we get to meet the legends who have made such terrific accomplishments in the field, and our focus is so confined. I think it's been very productive exchange. So to turn to my remarks, we're focusing on the value and the meaning of the Milgram, the obedience experiments. So the value, for me, is raising the question of genocidal violence associated with the Holocaust. That's what grabs me. That's what grabs my undergraduate students. Now the meaning, I want to say a couple of things about meaning, what it tells us about Milgram and his context. Lee Ross spoke this morning about Milgram experiment as a demonstration, high impact, socially relevant. I wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Social Psychology, or Experimental Social Psychology, and I discussed this aspect of certain experiments in the classical era of experimental social psychology. I was thinking of Muzafer Sharif's autokinetic effect, Solomon Ash's line discrimination task, and Stan Milgram's classic experiment. What they all had in common was no test of significance, there's no statistics, there's no test of specific theories, no meaningful literature review. And so I had some observations about this. I don't want to disparage them because of these observations. The first point I want to say is that these studies have a pedagogical value. They're meant to tell us something important about social life. Now, this approach has not always attracted positive attention among experimental social psychologists. I remember a comment from Leon Festinger, who had this to say: "From my biased point of view," and certainly it was Festinger, I always had an opinion, "there was some confusion between relevant and newsworthy. Certainly if some finding was picked up by the mass media, there was clear evidence that it was relevant. One can improvise a jail and have subjects volunteer. One can then report some interesting reactions of certain individuals, and it's an important topic and certainly newsworthy, but it's not research. It does not seriously attempt to look at relationships between variables and yields no new knowledge. It's just staging a happening." So I don't know whether or not is true of the autokinetic effect. The autokinetic effect was trying to illustrate how norms evolve. Ash's line discrimination task was preoccupied with not propaganda, but the conditions under which people could resist propaganda. And Milgram's cautionary tale was about the capacity for extraordinary violence in ordinary people. It seems to me that Stan Milgram embedded his study at every occasion in the story of the Holocaust. That's its relevance. But it's never, by the way, to illustrate the possibility of heroic resistance. But if you looked at the results in a different way, that's the heartwarming part of the story, but that's not the one that we tend to emphasize. I should also mention, it seems to me that most of the replications also commit this type of error. It's always about the negative aspect of the story. Now, so that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is that these kinds of studies borrow from our common sense knowledge of social structure. And if you didn't already have a preoccupation in the life world with these topics, the staging of the experiments would be an impertinence. That is to say, you know what propaganda is like? Well, look at the line discrimination task. And people would say, it has nothing to do with propaganda. No, it's illustrating how it works. And so we can benefit from that type of demonstration. But the other problem with that is that the experimental trappings lead us to give the pedagogy more scientific credence than it would have otherwise. Now, the third thing that I had observed about these types of experiments is that oftentimes the demonstrations are employed to raise issues that are not really quite scientific in nature. So recall Milgram's speculation at the end of the 1974 book and at the end of that 45-minute film that everybody's seen so many times. He says something like, mankind may not be able to survive the fatal vulnerability of malevolent authority. He talks about the possibility that this could spell the end of the species. It's a profound issue. It grabs the undergraduate like nothing else, because you're talking about questions of existence. But it's more a philosophical issue than a fitting conclusion drawn from a scientific study of facts. But that's part of the enduring attraction of the classics. Now back to meaning. So I said in his context, that's where we find some of the meaning. The question of meaning is not just what he achieved in his own time, but what he contributes to our own contemporary period. What he can contribute to our own time, I think, has been tempered by the archival work which has appeared in the last decade, which puts his work in a new light. And consider Gina Perry's book. Actually, when I got the notice of the conference, I have a very busy summer, even though I'm retired. And I didn't want to come to this conference because I've got other things to do, as everybody else does. But when I read her book, I changed all my plans. I just showed up earlier this week after a week of kayaking, and then next week I have a week of cycling in Idaho. At any rate, I thought her book was riveting. And at any rate, what I liked in particular were three things. Evidence of the long-term harm, which I had never seen discussed in this context. In my, I have good relations, for the most part, with people in the psychology department, but they're of the view that the regulations of psychologists studying human subjects is overextensive, that it's inappropriate. The types of stresses that people experience in the lab are the sort of things that should be able to absorb in everyday life. And when I read Perry's book, in fact, I was horrified that there was not just harm, but that people had vivid memories decades after exposure to the experiment. Now, to be fair, she doesn't have a systematic sampling of all those hundreds and hundreds of people, but she has enough cases to make you pay attention to the possibility of harm. This has been a live issue for myself because when I've worked in the past with people in social psychology, I did some work on the effects of pornography on behavior, and people were making the claims that they could produce non-transitory changes for the worse in people's attitudes and in their tendency to be aggressive with women. I didn't believe it, but it's a nice thing to claim because they're saying you can't replicate my work because it's so damaging to the subjects. At any rate, and I couldn't replicate their work, and I found it to be a dead end. The second thing that I found interesting in her work was the widespread evidence of suspicions about the cover story. Now, she talked about that this morning, and I don't need to make any further comment. And the third thing was the unearthing of the intimate relations study, which was never published. Now, the other thing that when I think of the meaning and relevance of Stanley Milgram is that what I find relevant, or our consideration, is the lack of assistance that Stanley Milgram's agentic state provides in understanding either the Holocaust or contemporary genocide. We've seen several people mention the work of Browning. Christopher Browning bends over backwards to try and acknowledge the contribution of Milgram. But he also says, you know what? Major Trapp was a very weak authority figure. The men loved him. They didn't fear him. They probably cooperated out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of manliness, out of a sense of sticking up for the team, not because of intimidation or duress. Stanley Milgram, I think, gets his interpretation of Milgram right out of Barton Oren. He doesn't believe a word of it, and he's quite critical. My own study of the Rwandan genocide provides a picture at marked contrast to the Milgram depiction. When we look at the perpetrators in the Rwandan case, we're struck by enthusiastic murderers engaging in righteous slaughter, not the banality of evil, not desk murderers, which was the image behind Milgram. There's a couple of people I've referred to the work of David Cesarini, and Cesarini, like other historians, have come very uncomfortable with the picture of Eichmann suggested in the work of Hannah Arendt and Milgram. One of the things that Deborah Lipstadt, in her recent book on the trial of Eichmann, emphasizes in the very personal role, the charge that the take charge attitude that Eichmann showed when he went to when it was clear that the war looked like it was being lost, he went to Hungary and organized the deportation of 440,000 Hungarian Jews. It's in 8 weeks, when Himmler's telling him to stand down and try to negotiate a better relationship. This man was exemplified, taking charge of the Holocaust. So, what, am I getting too? Yeah. Okay, skip that. And at any rate, what I'm saying is that when we look at the level of the behavior of perpetrators, whether it's in the Auschwitz trials, whether it's the trials in Cambodia, we have smug, indifferent individuals who have been very effective in bringing about mass murder, and they undertake their task with what I would characterize as panache, not fear, not duress. And just as an aside on that, it seems to me that I discussed this in a book that I mentioned this morning, but most people were in bed, I gather, at 8:30. I have a book coming out with Oxford later this month, as a matter of fact, Beyond the Banality of Evil, and which I kind of contrast the mentality that we presuppose in criminal trials. In criminal trials, we usually presume that actors are morally sensitive, that you can get to them and get admission of guilt. We find the complete opposite of that in the people who are appearing before the international tribunals. That people don't have an iota of a sense of guilt, of conscience, of pangs of misgivings. It seems to be quite the opposite, which suggests that the whole model of criminal trial is premised on morally sensitive individuals, which is a misplaced assumption. So I've suggested if that's accurate, then you'll need to do something not instead of criminal trials, but maybe in combination with civil procedures for compensation, as well as truth and reconciliation commissions, so that you get polymorphic legal responses to these tragic situations. Okay, so you got a minute? Just one last thing. There's a temptation to mythologize in conferences like this. I think that when we turn to Milgram and with the focus on obedience to authority, it seems to me the type of information that we should be getting from the social sciences is not obedience to authority, but how do we understand the resistance to authority? The resistance to authority in Native peoples who are experiencing a backlash against the post-colonial governance. We have currently in Canada a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is exploring that. We have as some people refer to, the Arab Spring. And so we've got a series of reactions, the Occupy movement, where in fact we have people rebelling against authority. It seems to me we ought to be turning the Milgram story upside down to get to that aspect of his contribution. Thank you.
Matthew? Okay. Hello. Well, I have made just 5 points for you on the value and meaning of the obedience research. So I'll try to be quite brief. And I will start with a quote from Abel Herzberg, who was one of the first Dutch Jews who filed a report on the Jewish extortion in World War II in 1950. And he was very critical about what happened in the Netherlands, and he was very critical on the attitude of Dutch people toward Jews. And in many of his talks, at the end of the talk, one woman came to him and asked the question, well, how would we prevent our children to become a victim? And then the answer of Herzberg was, well, I think that the better way to put this is, how do we prevent your children to become a perpetrator? That quote really struck me because, as I said yesterday already, I think that the essential meaning of the obedience experiment is not resistance. I think that the essential meaning of the obedience experiment is the individual vulnerability to strong situations. People submit to the situational factors that are at work there. So it's individual vulnerability. And why is that important? I think it's especially important in nowadays life, because we live in individualistic societies where there is a huge belief in individual capacity to rule our, to take care of our lives, to organize our lives, whatever things. And I think that in a period of, in an historical period of what I tend to call ego inflation, that it's really very important to learn that egos or individuals really are vulnerable in certain situations. So I think that this is the meaning at this moment in our history. Then coming to another point. Well, as probably everybody who has done obedience research knows, that when you publish your findings, as we did in the early 80s, that you get a mass attention from journalists and TV and whatever. And that happened to me too. And basically, when I told every individual and every journalist about our findings, then I saw almost everybody think, when I told the results, the first question that almost everybody I saw coming up in those persons was, what would I have done in that situation? And then the people that were somewhat more courageous, they also asked that. Well, should I have done it? And then my answer always has been, well, of course I cannot predict for sure, but the question you have to ask yourself is, why would you be different from the majority? So that was my answer always. So that was another way of saying that individuals are really vulnerable to strong situations. Then, second point. Probably the sociologists in this room know about the theory of Granovetter, the strength of weak ties. And this strength of weak ties theory says that in order to get further in society, you need a lot of informal, not of informal, but formal ties. You need a strong formal social network. That really helps you go around in the world. And I think that's an interesting theory, but what the Milgram study shows is not the strength of weak ties, it shows the weakness of weak ties. Because as we have shown in our administrative obedience studies, is that in fact, people obey because their relationship with the victim is a very weak one. And that's basically, that's saying something about the social fabric of modern societies. So the Milgram experiment, the value of nowadays, in our nowadays times, is that it's a demonstration of the weakness of weak ties. Then a third point, the ethical discussion. Well, of course, it's very important to have that. But when I was sitting in yesterday and hearing the debate, one study came to my mind, and that was the study of Bigman and Sarantello, published in 1978, I believe in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. And there what they showed was that ethical concern is related to level of obedience. So when, in one condition, when the subjects learned that there was a huge obedience, they were more ethical critical about the experiment. So the ethical debate is really related to the level of obedience. And I think it is important to have that in mind when we talk about that. So, because it could be a sort of a denial of, well, a sort of reasoning away of the fact of obedience. Then the two questions that you asked. What new things have you learned in this conference? Well, basically, I think that maybe Milgram's study was too smooth. Maybe he just didn't tell about the methodological flaws of his experiments, and as I understand now, he surely was not very informative about the way he debriefed and dehoaxed his subjects. So, but I must say, add to that really for me, of course, the debriefing thing is very bad, and it's really not compatible with what the psychologist would do with his subjects. But of course, this point does not take away the significance of the findings. So a study might be unethical, but its results are methodological sound. They are what they are, real results. So I'm going to read Gina's book. I have it now, and maybe that will change my appreciation of those studies, but I'll have to see. Then the second question: are we making more out of the studies than we should do? And to my opinion, a direct comparison with the Holocaust is really inappropriate. And I think that has been demonstrated yesterday in one of the talks. So maybe the experiment could say something about the psychological condition that perpetrators in the Holocaust were in. But the subject in the laboratory is really somebody different from a perpetrator in the Holocaust, I would say. So that might be making too much of it. Another thing of making more is maybe there is too much talk, too much discussion about the experiments because there is too little, there's the number of empirical studies is too small. So there's much talk because there's less empirical results. So, and therefore I think that it's really important to consider that we can do active role play, and you really can use the procedure of administrative obedience. You really can do that nowadays. So if there would be a 60th anniversary conference, maybe we could have somewhat more empirical results. Then are we making more of it? A third point on that. Well, when you look at the history of psychology, and when you look at findings in psychological research, there are two ways to doubt those findings. And the first way is just that we have findings that have very low effect sizes, and that we have findings that are not replicable. Maybe you know about studies on gene-environment interactions. Replicability of those studies is about 20%. So if we have a study that has high replicability, that's really very important. So then we have passed the first level of psychological research, a finding that's really sound, that is replicable. And the classical psychological studies, social psychological studies, Ash study and also Milgram studies, they really pass that threshold. So they are very important because we know that we can replicate those findings. And then, of course, for this, well, I would say a really small set of studies, then we have a second level of critique. What do they actually mean? And of course, it's good to discuss about that, but we should never forget that we can discuss this issue because we have sound and replicable findings. So that's really an important meaning of the Milgram studies, I would say. Thank you.
Okay. I recently had an opportunity to review recent articles, research, commentary, largely outside of social psychology. All of them dated after 2000, many of them much more recent than that. And just to see where the Milgram experiments are being cited, how are they being discussed in a host of areas. Most of them dealing with business ethics, legal and philosophical studies, a couple of medical journals, a diverse military journals, diverse domains. And I was, that's what the meaning of the Milgram experiments means to me. It's the issue of the generalization of the studies to these other domains. And so I was unfamiliar with almost all of this literature, I must confess. And I really found an amazing amount of activity and citation of Milgram in these citations. And many of them were quite impressive, quite dutifully knowledgeable about the Milgram research. It wasn't just a kind of glib passing reference, although you do see a lot of those as well. The question regarding the generalization of the Milgram experiments, which leads, of course, to the meaning that the studies have, the value that the studies have for these other scholars and researchers who are citing Milgram for a purpose, for a payoff to their own analysis. In other words, they're citing Milgram intentionally because they feel that that citation helps their case. Now, occasionally they may be critical of Milgram, but I would say that most of the citations I ran into were certainly enthusiastic and endorsing the value of his stuff. Let me just read you one example. I don't think Pat Werhane is here today, but I don't think so. But it's a quotation from her. She has a recent book out, including Milgram's name in the title. She quotes as follows: they consider the case of Betty Vinson, an employee at WorldCom. Vinson, the WorldCom employee who was convicted for her role in inflating that company's profits using fraudulent accounting practices, knew that her decisions led to acts that were both wrong and illegal. However, by all accounts, Vinson was deeply troubled by the unethical behavior at WorldCom. She voiced discomfort to her superiors, repeatedly considered resignation, and communicated her unease to her colleagues. Meanwhile, however, under the CEO Scott Sullivan, Vinson continued to participate in the massive accounting of fraud, a decision that would eventually result in a long conviction and prison sentence. As Milgram's experiments demonstrated, it is difficult to follow one's conscience when pressured by authority figures. Many of Milgram's subjects, like Vinson, continue to obey despite voicing strong moral objections to the orders they were given. These subjects, though unable to develop a mental model that would rationalize their unethical behavior, and that was Lee's point, and I think that's regarding the crucial importance of staying at the task, and the driver of that in many instances appears to be the participants' own resolution of dissonance or misgivings to rationalize, therefore allowing him or her to continue and escalate. These subjects, though unable to develop a mental model that would rationalize their unethical behavior, also appeared unable to muster the resources to follow their conscience. I mean, so she's describing Vinson as not as a happy camper, but continuously doing the wrong thing, not resolving it, but sort of continuously struggling, but still obeying orders. In my mind, that's one of the best quotes I could cite in terms of being a kind of prototype for how Milgram's research is being used in other domains. That research. A lot of it appears in a journal that I had never seen before called the Journal of Business Ethics. If you want to see a lot of citations of Stanley Milgram, just browse through the Journal of Business Ethics. It'll take you days and days. I never dreamed that they were so interested in Milgram and made so much use of it. Now, so you see a lot of citations. I mean, whether or not you approve of them or you feel that it's justified that these other scholars use Milgram's work in that way, that's another question. But my point is that it's out there. It's really present in the literature. So it's not just a guess on our part that it's it's still popular and so forth. Now, an evaluation of these generalizations, I go back largely to Douglas Mook's famous paper in the American Psychologist, I think in '83, on the generalization process. And the main point that he made, for my purposes at least, is that a generalization should be based on theory. In other words, no one generalizes the shock generator to WorldCom. You generalize the theoretical understanding or processes that Milgram or others have used to explain their findings, and you take those theoretical explanations for Milgram, and you see if those theoretical understandings can generalize to a new phenomenon or a new domain. That's quite a complicated process to track, because you've got to have a theory for X, Milgram, and you've got to have a theory for Y, the domain to be generalized to, and then you've got to assess whether there's comparability in those processes that make the generalization convincing. So this is kind of difficult for Milgram, because we've heard for a couple of days now that there's a paucity of really good theory to explain what he found. So how in the hell are these people doing all this generalizing if they, at least in Mook's thesis, that what generalizes is theory rather than findings? I mean, this isn't an applied problem where they're trying to grow corn better, and so they use Milgram's corn mechanism to have higher corn in their fields. It's not what Mook called the agricultural model of generalization, but it's more of a kind of a basic process-oriented generalization. So I was able, at least for my purposes, to extract several theoretical processes from Milgram. Now I realize that's going to perhaps disappoint you or strain your credulity, but I find quite a bit of theorizing in Milgram's work. It isn't tight, it isn't hypothetico-deductive, he's not trying to reject a null hypothesis, he's not doing a lot of the things that we associate with theory development and falsification and testing critical mediating processes and contesting two different theories. He's not doing that, but he is doing quite a bit of pretty good explanation, some of it very good, and I think some of it worthy of note. One process, for example, was the incremental nature of the harm doing. That's been emphasized from the day one, that he used this incrementing 15 volts at a time. And of course that became a very important research area on the escalation of commitment. There's a lot of research on that. Milgram said, as the subject delivers more and more painful shocks, he must seek to justify to himself what he has done. One form of justification is to go to the end. For if he breaks off, he must say to himself, everything I have done to this point is bad, and I now acknowledge it by breaking off. I mean, I saw a resonance of that in Lee Ross's discussion yesterday on the justification process. And I cite other studies of the escalation effect, Gino and Basserman and Hartson and Sherman. Two related studies by Martins using a novel bug-killing paradigm have recently obtained strong evidence for an escalation of harming effect. The author's conclusion is similar to Milgram's. The motivational theorizing that explained the current data that repeated killing can drive people to kill again in an effort to justify their prior actions and in turn keep dissonance at bay. Now that to me is a very impressive generalization. That is, they're going from Milgram to a novel bug-killing paradigm, and I think PSPB, there were a couple of studies, and linking it by a process analysis, a fairly good, up-to-date, empirically supported theory. It wasn't then at the time Milgram used it. His was more or less a kind of off-the-top, intuitive kind of thesis that one of the dynamics would be a kind of escalation of commitment, a kind of entrapment, other words. And so you see a number of studies that support these processes in other domains, and collectively, I think it's a reasonably impressive package. Other theoretical processes are dehumanization. Now, Milgram, of course, the proximity series was a famous set of 4 studies where he himself said that as proximity between the teacher and learner decreased, ending up in the touch proximity, that somewhat incredible variation, there was less obedience. In other words, it was less easy to dehumanize the victim if you're actually in face-to-face and literally touching the person. And so it would be easier to harm somebody if they were distant and remote and you couldn't see them and hear them, and that whole line of reasoning. Well, the dehumanization idea with Bandura in particular, moral disengagement, Nick Haslam's work on dehumanization, it's a very voguish, exciting research area and has been for 20 years now. It was in Herb Kelman's classic 1973 paper on sanctioned massacres. He had 3, by the way, let me just take time out. This sounds like ingratiation, but trust me, it isn't.
Whenever someone says that, you know.
It's like saying it isn't about the money. Herb in 1973 published an article in the Journal of Social Issues on the My Lai massacre and related phenomena, and he had 3 pillars of his model: authorization, dehumanization, and routinization. He included Milgram in the authorization part. He included something else in the dehumanization part and something else in the routinization part. But that was an early statement of dehumanization, and now there must be hundreds of very reputable articles in mainstream journals on that process and related processes, infrahumanization and other related constructs. So, if you're willing to see Milgram as having shown dehumanization, I mean, if you buy into that explanation, which he himself, I think he used the word literally, and Bandura did a study where he analyzed several of Milgram's experiments, and he thought that dehumanization, he saw in part as linked to the delegitimization of the authority figure. That obedience decreased as the humanization of the learner increased. There's a good, the meaning of the Milgram experiments crystallized down to a focus on dehumanization really takes on, I think, a fairly tight connection. And there are other, I go on with other cognitive tuning and moral responsibility. There's a lot of discussion in the legal journals on free will and the question of whether there's an exoneration of the perpetrator due to the situational pressures and so forth. There's a lot of really good scholarly analyses of that effect. So I think, at least in this type of prism, looking at this this slice of scholarship and research, one sees a lot of Milgram presence in these non-social psychological domains, and I find it reasonably impressive that it's taken as a whole. You're seeing a strong kind of contemporary attention to Milgram and a kind of critical usage of Milgram. Sometimes it's, of course, not based on theoretical processes. It's just, and in that sense, I think Milgram has perhaps, I liken it to a runaway train, a locomotive. Just, people will take whatever they want from Milgram and generalize, like they'll just run amok with it. They'll simply say, for example, that a recent study found that, you know, one of the biggest problems in medicine is non-compliance with doctor's orders to take medicine. That's the guy had data showing there's a tremendous reticence on the part of patients who receive orders from their physician, if you want to call that orders. He writes a prescription and says, take this or you'll die. You know, for your blood pressure, for your cholesterol, for your kidneys, for your heart. I mean, who here would say if a doctor gave me medicine, I wouldn't take it? You know, probably you would all, most of you would say I would take it. So to find empirical evidence that there's tremendous non-compliance rates on the part of good people, people like us, and this guy, all he did was he mentioned Milgram in simply saying, hey, Milgram is wrong. They don't obey. That was it. Now, does that study impress you? I don't know. It's not terribly gripping. It doesn't deal with any process. There's no theoretical understanding at issue here. He just simply, for that researcher, it was enough simply to say, we didn't find obedience where we thought it's Milgram related, and it's a disconfirmation of Milgram. So you see some of that. You know, you won't see Milgram everywhere like you like him. And it won't always, you know, make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. Oh, what a wonderful linkage. You know. That's Milgram. I mean, people play by different rules with that study. They feel free to take it. A guy wrote an analysis of the film Remains of the Day, which I love, by the way, that film, and used Milgram to explain it. And I thought it was magnificent. I really enjoyed that film more for understanding Milgram. But that's the kind of stretch that study has. And it's had it for a long time. And the stuff I'm telling you about is current as can be. It's not 80s or 70s. It's 2012 citation. So that's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Well, this has been a very rewarding conference, and it's been particularly interesting to me to have the experience of sort of having Milgram insiders, real insiders, who know where all the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. Folks like me who are, by any definition, a mainstream social psychologist, so I probably know about as much about it and its influence and how it fits into the bigger picture as anyone alive, but I didn't really know the intimate details of it. And then, of course, we have folks here who are from other disciplines who know it in relationship to how it particularly touches their discipline. And it's been very interesting, sort of having this exchange of perspectives. I want to start out by just an interesting observation about science, and that is, as was noted by our first speaker, both the Asch experiment and the Milgram experiment are famous for not having control groups. And of course, the insider would tell you the reason they're famous for not having control groups is that in both cases, they are the control group. They're the control group for a different imagined study, which I can enlarge upon if you'd like. But our real topic today is exactly understanding why has the Milgram experiment had so much impact, so much staying power. And I can start out by saying whatever else it was, and it was many things, it was a classic piece of reality theater or reality TV, very much aided by the film, which literally was reality TV. With 4 subjects, it had about as much information as the average candid camera sequence. You saw 4 people selected for reasons that were not made clear. But that doesn't alone explain their power. That explains why it was possible for them to have power, but not why they did. I would say much of their power arises because they are a prompt to think about the power of the situation and of social influence. Notice I use the word a prompt rather than the word proof. They're a prompt to think about the capacity of social influence to create behavior that is incongruent with shared moral values. Of course, if you want to understand much of the most atrocious behavior in human history, it's not human history that occurs despite the values of the individuals. It's behavior that occurs in service of those values. But the unique feature of the Milgram experiment, and what it enlightens us about to some extent, is behavior that is incongruent with the values that people would say they hold. And in that respect, I think it was a very insightful contribution in this conference to liken the influence of the Milgram paradigm, or the relevance of the Milgram paradigm, in some ways much more to the doings of corporate America and the people that serve it than the perpetrators of the Holocaust. I said it's a prompt, not a proof, partially because the proof of ordinary people who in many contexts in their lives are good citizens, good Christians, good people, good neighbors, the capacity of those people to do terrible things scarcely needed the Milgram experiment to have that demonstrated. Ordinary good people, the Pilgrims, those good guys who had the funny hats and sat down for dinner with the native people. Within 15 years, the heads of some of the people who had been at that meeting were on spikes outside the village. So ordinary people do terrible things. We don't need to look only at the Holocaust, the willing participants, and the willing bystanders to the Holocaust, not just the perpetrators. I think Milgram understood very well that it didn't pertain to the most important agents of the Holocaust. It pertained perhaps to the guys who sold the barbed wire, or the guys who provided the potatoes, or maybe, in some cases, the people who simply filed the papers. But we don't need to look to Nazi Germany or the distant history of the United States. We can look beyond apartheid or Jim Crow to today, to the failure of ordinary people to ease suffering and massive social and economic inequality around the world. We have the capacity as individuals to do something about it. Very few of us do. We all have our story, our justification for being able to explain why that happens. In terms of the power and influence of the Milgram experiments, I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Art did. We were asked to think about, is this a kind of Rorschach where everybody reads into it what they want to read into it? I would say it's more like a banquet in which everybody tastes a particular portion of the banquet. Or maybe we could say this is giving him too much credit, it's like a classic piece of music. Let's say Ode to Joy, which many, many people will enjoy at different levels. The connoisseurs will tell you about the tonal structure. Other people will just say it's a great melody that I can hum, and I want to have it at my wedding. But different people will take different things from it. Most importantly, it is literally the crown jewel of the situationist tradition. It is the most impressive demonstration that contriving a particular situation in a particular way can produce behavior that defies the expectations and predictions, and to some extent the understandings of ordinary people thinking about it. Even ordinary people who understand the details of what the situation actually looked like quite well. And I would say that's because, like all cases where small or seemingly small manipulations, or maybe I would say seemingly insufficient manipulations, produce big effects, it's because there are two keys. First of all, what appear to be small manipulations aren't really small at all. They're manipulations that are very big. They're manipulations in which you're doing something small to evoke or bring to bear something rather big and important. And the second thing is, when you see a situation that produces a very dramatic effect, looking for the cause is a fool's errand, because almost always, if something is very big and robust, you know it's overdetermined. Many, many things went into it. So, what are some of the things that went into the Milgram experiment? What are some of the things in this particular banquet? And again, I'm going to be covering some of the same ground as Art did, with a slightly different twist. First of all, it is absolutely a classic within the Lewinian tradition on the study of channel factors. The Milgram experiment was brilliantly contrived, although Milgram didn't say this as explicitly as he might have, to first get someone started in a channel of obedience, partially by the contract, partially by the agreement, partially by the acceptance, by actually accepting shocks on one's own. So it would have been inconceivable to disobey at the very beginning. And then it becomes an experiment about the difficulty of disobeying when there isn't a clear channel for disobedience. In part, people disobeyed not because they were unwilling to disobey, not because they were convinced that they had to obey. They just didn't know how to disobey, or at least how to disobey effectively. Clearly, as we've talked about, the role of dissonance reduction and rationalization, as Milgram himself mentioned, was critical. The step-by-step structure in that experiment, I think, did brilliantly both utilize and anticipate psychology's continuing fascination with the interplay between behavior and belief, or behavior and attitude, that we can change behavior or invoke behavior by creating the right beliefs, but we also can produce the right beliefs by producing the behavior that's congruent with those beliefs. It's also about the importance of social scripts or schemas, social contracts, social identities. In each case, people have roles, are acting within their understanding of what those roles demand, and people find it very difficult to step outside the role demands of a situation without adequate justification, especially when other people are fulfilling their responsibilities within those roles. In a way, the experimenter did exactly what he had said he would do in that situation. To some extent, the learner continued to do exactly what he said or was contracted to do. So it required a considerable effort and a considerable exercise of imagination and freedom for the teacher to step outside that situation. It's also about the particular power or the particular situational press and particular susceptibility that people experience in novel situations. Most of us know how to handle attempts to control our behavior in situations that are familiar to us. So when someone phones you up and says, and asks for your money, even though it's a socially sanctioned thing, you have your excuse ready at your fingertips. I already gave at the office. I never say yes to a telephone solicitation. Send me your literature and I'll consider it. Everybody in this room has a script available that they know how to use. If you're a professor, they don't often ask for your money, but God knows they ask for your time. And I'm very busy, I'd like to do it, I'm overcommitted, I have 2 other reviews to do, I have a deadline on this book I have to reach. We all know how to extricate ourselves from those difficult situations. The Milgram experiment is cunning in its construction insofar as you're asked to do something that is seemingly normative by some definition, and you have no experience at all in extricating yourself from that kind of situation. The most important and heroic examples we know of disobedience don't occur because someone in the moment just happens to disobey. They think long and hard about what the justification that's been offered and how to effectively disobey. I might also say the Milgram experiment, in an interesting way, anticipates one of the modern classics, which is the study of the importance of default options. Many of you here know about the famous organ donation study in which you account for the difference between the rate at which people agree to sign the back of their license plate in a way that makes their organs available for harvesting between 2 countries famous for the enormous cultural differences, namely Sweden and Norway, where you have a 95% compliance rate in one and a 10%, I'm making those numbers up, but that's exactly the right order of magnitude, in the other. And what's the difference? In one society, you're told, if you want to donate your organs, sign here. In the other, you're told, your organs will be donated, unless, of course, you don't want to, in which case you can just sign here. It's a brilliant example of a kind of paternalistic control. Paternalistic libertarianism, actually. The Milgram experiment is also one where the situation is cunningly set up so that the default is continuing. The action that requires justification is not continuing. And there, as everywhere, the nature of the social structure and the nature of the situation conveys clues as to what's normative. Tom Gilovich and I and some of our students have done research showing that you just don't happen to get this difference between the opt-in and opt-out societies because people in one country just find it a little easier to opt out and the others not. The meaning of the situation has changed enormously. So basically, in the opt-in countries, you're told, are you one of those kind of leftist tree huggers, liberals who don't give a damn how they desecrate your body after you die? If so, sign here. In the opt-out countries, we're told normal good citizens, of course, do this. But if you're some kind of religious nut or misanthrope and you don't want to do what everyone else does, sign here. Right? We don't quite demonstrate exactly that in our study, but we come pretty close. Well, the Milgram situation is one where the very structure of the situation implies that compliance is the normative and normal and unexceptional thing to do. No one says that. Milgram doesn't say, you're the first person who's refused. He doesn't have to. The mere fact that the experimenter seems to think it's perfectly normal and that of course you should go on. Everyone else has. Why would you imagine otherwise? Well, I could go on like that, but I'd also say the Milgram situation in being a banquet for everyone also is a banquet for its critics. And if you want to do a famous study in social psychology, it's a really good idea to choose your critics carefully and give them lots of ammunition. And Milgram certainly did that by attacking, that was a Freudian slip, by attracting the influence of people like Ken Ring and Diana Baumrind and others. So the critics, first of all, were many of them were already armed to object to the classic high-impact experiments. To some extent, their objections were well-founded reservations about the extravagant claims and the scientism of those studies, the pretense that there was something more than they were, which, as I said, they were dramatic and important demonstrations of what can happen. They weren't demonstrations of what must happen. They weren't demonstrations of what always happens. They weren't robust in the classic sense that a physicist would use the word, which is you could change all the things that were irrelevant to the stated theory and get the same result. They didn't have any of that property, but they did have the property to prompt us to think about the world differently, and that was their contribution. And also, they insisted on using statistics and numbers, which offended humanists a great deal because it seemed to imply that if you didn't have a number, if you didn't have a hypothesis, if you weren't doing a study that was falsifiable, if you weren't testing a theory that was falsifiable, you weren't doing real science. For those of you who heard me giving one of our presenters a hard time about that, I was trying to give them actually a straight line. I was trying to let them say, you know, a theory can be important not because it gives rise to falsifiable hypotheses. It's valuable because it helps you understand the world. But for some reason or other, that person thought I was attacking them. Anyway, beyond the obvious, that there were obvious exposing the jugular to critics in terms of features of the methodology, the inadequacy of not so much informed consent, but the manifestly inadequate debriefing procedures, and I must say the write-up, which projected exactly the kind of smart-ass superior looking down from on high at people like they're kind of insects, that kind of feeling that one had. I'm not saying Milgram really had that view. I'm saying for a critic, it was easy to see Milgram as someone who thought of himself, or at least was exalting social psychology, as if they're kind of Prosperos or Machiavellis, able to make people into puppets who dance on the string the way the clever experimenter wants them to be. There were even echoes of going back to the days of psychology and mind control and Vance Packard and all that kind of stuff. There were all those echoes, and it was only a decade removed from that when he did the study. There were also important philosophical issues, right ones, to be observed, and that is, to what extent is it okay to use people as objects, even objects of demonstration? Under what circumstances is that legitimate? And in this case, the harm wasn't just the feeling that people would believe that I did a bad thing. It was that I am a person capable of doing a bad thing, and by extension, I am like them. When the them isn't people who gave shock in the Milgram experiment, the them is torturers and Holocaust participants and the like. And ironically, in this, the subjects were falling prey to the most important, or at least the most obvious phenomena in all of social psychology, which is the tendency to make inappropriate dispositional inferences, the tendency to assume that that behavior just simply reflects the dispositions. Okay, my personal takeaway, 1 minute. I found the details fascinating from the archives. It was a great reminder about the way in which a social experiment is a dynamic social process. And that, of course, the report of an experiment is just that. It's like a reporter telling you what happened at an event. And of course, it's sharpened, leveled, tuned to hypothesis, includes the critical details that are attractive to include and omits the ones that get in the way of the story. It also caused me to reflect again on the value and limitations of demonstration experiments, which I described as studies of what can happen, not what must or even is most likely to happen. And finally, I just want to say that it reminded me of the way in which the Milgram experiment can be flipped. It can be flipped to say it holds important implications, not for the banality of evil, but the banality of virtue, how people can be led step by step to do positive things using the same principles. It also was important to me in reminding me that you can flip the study around and talk about the problem of disobedience. And in fact, I think the Milgram experiment may be most important in educational terms, not for informing us about the Holocaust, which I think it's of limited value, but giving us clues about the most important aspect of disobedience. When to disobey, why to disobey, and most importantly of all, how to disobey. And I'll close with that.
I'm going to give panelists an opportunity to respond to each other a little bit, maybe 5 minutes, and then we'll see if. Yeah, I know.
Just
You want to go straight to?
Yeah.
Let's just open up the
That's
questions.
fine. I
And
just
we
want to
can,
ask.
we can go in passing and we'll address each other's remarks that way too.
Okay, I just want to ask one question of Lee, which is the reference to the ASH study. What was the anticipated experimental condition in the ASH
Well,
study?
Ash and Sheriff are always grouped together as if there's the Sheriff study and then there's the Ash study, and the Ash study is the more dramatic version of it. Ash did the study because he thought Sheriff was a fraud. He was trying to disprove. He said this was a conjurer's trick, the Sheriff
Yeah.
experiment.
Or he's taken in by his own illusion,
Well, no, he was.
which is what he said in his book.
Yeah, he said that, but he saw Sheriff as a politico, and that this was a complicated Marxist point about creating reality. And so he set out to do his famous experiment by showing that if you gave people a concrete task, they wouldn't obey, they wouldn't conform. So he did his first version of relatively easy tasks, and he got 35% conformity. So he said, damn it, that's not, I'm going to make it really easy so no fool could possibly get it wrong. And so he created the Ash experiment that we know, and the rate of conformity dropped all the way from 35% to 33%.
That's right.
And now, but Ash was as clever a psychologist as has ever lived, and he quickly understood what he had. And that's the reason why, as I think you know, the experiment is almost compulsive in its discussion of debriefing, because all that debriefing is about what was the subject's view of the situation. And Ash saw this heroic struggle between the desire to maintain autonomy and report what you actually perceived, and the demands of the situation, the demand to be right and the demand to fit in the group. So that's the short answer.
Nestor.
I just wanted to make an observation. I was really enjoying the talk, but also I enjoyed how Neil would write the bad news on a yellow piece of paper, pass it along, which basically the mission said, it's time to wind it up. We've got 1 more minute. And it passed along the group, and I could see as soon as Gus grabbed it, he was like, oh, well, I'll pass that on.
Yeah.
And then Wim had it, and he passed it on, and I was like, oh, I can't wait for it. It goes to Lee Ross, and Lee Ross is like, looks at it, it's like, oh, okay, and it was a lot slower, it's like passing it over, and I was looking at the experiment myself. I thought that was wonderful. Well done, Neil. Nice manipulative trick, and well used.
Thank you. Sure.
Hi, I'm an outsider to this literature. I came to the conference sort of naively assuming, based on the title alone, that this was about some field called obedience studies that would have like kind of a broad literature, and then I'd be hearing lots of different names. And instead, I've been hearing a lot about the Stanley Milgram guy, Milgram. But also too, and that's my naivety there. Also too, judging by the presentations I've seen, it's as much an anti-Milgram conference, or more so, than a Milgram conference. And something hasn't come up. Well, I just got here this morning, so maybe it happened yesterday. But it strikes me that part of the significance of Milgram's work is ideological. That it comes out at a moment in the wake of McCarthyism and during the heady days of the Cold War, when there's a strong emphasis in American society on conformism and social authority. And Milgram, his work does a couple of things. It says, on the one hand, for those of you who think evil is other, evil is out there, it's satanic, demonic, far away, something you can easily identify, you're wrong. Evil, sometimes at least, is quite close to home. It's among us, it's familiar, it's banal, it's normal. And that's shocking. And that people's ordinary moral sense can't be counted on as much as we'd like to think that it can. And secondly, that this social authority, this conformity, obedience, is problematic, dangerous, and maybe he makes some exaggerated claims, but it's an ideological claim, and it's one that you either kind of hear that and you go, yeah, exactly, man, right on, or you're like, no, this guy's a whack job. So I wonder if that's been explicitly addressed, and how we would explicitly address as scientists, because it seems to me that is such a big part of the charge of his work.
Well, the quick answer is that what Gina and some of the critics are doing is I saw this when I reviewed literature in the 70s for my book that I wrote 25 years ago. It was always anti-Milgram. And it always will be. I won't be here for the 75th. But I hope it's here, because this is a glorious setting. So this is really, in some sense, right in the tradition. It may seem, a little bit contestuous, or whatever the word I'm looking for, but it's really a modern take on an old story from day one with this guy. He was called a whack job. He was called much worse than that. And
And has a hard time getting funding.
And so it's really perfectly consistent. And I'm hoping, just while I have the floor for a second more, that these papers and these contrarian arguments make the light of day, and email them to the text authors. David Myers would love to hear from you. He will put it in his next edition. Some of these text authors are fastidious about including absolutely the newest take possible. And so we want to see this fermentation. I think it's really very healthy, actually.
I think that's completely at odds with our experience. If anyone has tried to publish any of these critiques in American Psychologist, you will be frozen out.
That's right.
I waited 2 years, not for rejection, but a suggestion that we can't publish this, because if we do, we're making the people in the profession vulnerable, because they will not be able to get their work funded, because the other psychologists will cite your work to say what they're doing is unscientific.
I'll talk about that.
So I took my paper, The Postmodern Experiment, I sent it to the British Journal of Sociology. They published it immediately, and no one ever read it, because I was preaching to the choir. Everybody said, of course that's true.
Well, that's the test. You're damn right, it's hard to get in. And there are powerful, probably, forces that will try to keep you out. I'll talk a little bit more about that tonight.
It's hard to, I get things rejected every day. It's hard to get things published these days.
That's a surprise.
I have a question or a comment for Augustine.
Yes.
Brannigan's paper, which I really appreciated. But you said you equated obedience with acting under duress and pressure.
Yeah.
And that has happened throughout, and I'm beginning to wonder, I mean, one of the things that I have to think about after this conference is whether obedience is the wrong word.
Well, that's exactly what.
But what I want to say is this, that when people are acting in the context of legitimate authority, you know, when the authority is really perceived as legitimate,
Yeah.
then people may act with a great deal of enthusiasm and with a sense of doing the right thing, even if they're uncomfortable about it.
Yeah.
They act with the sense, yes, this has to be done, this is right, and I'm happy to do it, even if it's painful in some respects. And somehow, I think the equation of at least obedience to legitimate authority as I understand it, with acting under pressure and duress, just doesn't.
But look at the film. I mean, what's the lesson of the film? That people automatically comply? No, people are badgered to comply. People resist. They're badgered, and that's putting them under duress. That's putting them under pressure. It's not like you're required. This is a contract. You must comply.
But the context of which you said it was that to take examples of the Holocaust, for instance.
Well, that was his example. You know, that was the centerpiece in the illustration. And everybody says it's irrelevant. Well, you know, I didn't choose it. I'm not the only person reacting against it. It's people working in that tradition. Cesarani, Lipstadt, who have written the biographies of Eichmann, said this conception is misleading. Yeah. So that's what I said. I appreciate everything that's been said here, but I am advocating going beyond the banality of evil. This work interests me, but it doesn't help me.
Yeah. I mean, what I want to say is that,
yep.
I mean, in cases like the Holocaust and
yeah.
and other kinds of situations, people may obey quite willingly and happily, even though they may not like what they're doing, but they obey willingly because they think it's right, they think it's proper, as long as they consider the authority legitimate. Yeah. And I think that's my only point.
Yeah, I want to say something.
Yeah.
One of the things, it's important to understand the studies almost as if they're fables. You're condensing a very complicated, long-standing process into something short. So the Milgram subject moves from indifference to destructive compliance or obedience in the course of half an hour. If you're talking about an Enron executive, they're doing it not in half an hour. They're doing it over a period of months and years with support, with peers doing likewise. And so the remarkable thing about the Milgram experiment is not that it demonstrates that you can get people to do remarkable things. It's that you can get them to do it more easily than you thought and more rapidly than you thought. My colleagues are always very distressed to find out in the Innocence Project how often we have false confessions. And they say, it's a very nice parallel, I would never confess, and you want to say, you know what, you haven't been in the experiment. And then when you start telling them some of the things that the police do to get false confessions, they start to go, wow, I didn't know that. And by the time you're really informed, you're actually impressed that there are as few false confessions as there really are. But the point is understanding it not as an attempt to create what happens in the real world over a long period of time, but an attempt to encapsulate that, to create it in a short period of time by having an exaggerated and simplified version of what goes on in the real world.
One of the things I've learned at this conference is the Stephen Gibson method of closing a session. Let me all invite you to continue these discussions over beer, over coffee, over dinner. Thank you for coming.